Welcome into the latest edition of the Sick Podcast with Draft Vogel. I'm John Vogel, and Mark Jarvis, Justin Gann will be joining me here in just a second. But first off, we got a good discussion that we've been kind of talking about in our group text last couple of days about information inside and outside of the building, and then checklists NFL teams put together. So just some more stuff for more food for thought, I think. Next week, going to have a special guest joining us, a 2024 NFL prospect. We'll talk more about that later, probably towards the end of the episode. But Shane, back in the studio. Let's hit it.
Turn up your volume. Because you're about to listen to The Sick Podcast. With Draft Vogel.
With the first pick in the 2021 NFL Draft. The first pick in the 2022 NFL Draft. With the first pick in the 2023 NFL Draft.
The sickest NFL draft show. It's gonna be sick.
And first, we talk about like all the selections, right? You got the NFL draft, and you got 256 guys that are going to get drafted. Depending on the year, that number varies. Sometimes 261, 258, whatever. But the first overall pick is always a big deal. And I think that you need to make sure that you pick properly the sports book that you're going to bet with, because this episode is presented by DraftKings. The NFL season is going strong, and the DraftKings Sportsbook is hooking up new customers with an offer that's even stronger. Bet $5 on any game this week to score $200 instantly in bonus bets. And DraftKings isn't stopping there. All customers can take advantage of a sweetener offer every game day this December. Get in on the game day great list. Download the DraftKings Sportsbook app now and use code SICKSPORTS. New customers can score $200 instantly by downloading this and using the code SICKSPORTS. Let's bring the guys in. Mark Jarvis, Justin Gamble, the co-host of this show now. Second week, Mark is with us, and Justin, regular for a while. Guys, how are we doing tonight?
Doing good.
Full of energy, buddy. On about 3 hours of sleep, crushing it. Just doing our best here. Pounding the coffee. I see you are too.
You're sleeping? You're sleeping?
I'm doing what? I said I'm gonna.
Yeah, I think we all pounded coffee here. I said you're sleeping.
3 hours of sleep. I'm on about 3 hours. So.
Well, I'm suggesting as that you're actually sleeping. You're getting some sleep.
Yeah, about 2.5, 3 a night. In between crushing the tape and stuff.
I was just insinuating that.
Yeah, I know.
It's tape and there's.
This is that time.
Transfer portal and everything else going on right now. Oh, it is. It's absolutely nuts. It's absolutely nuts. No, we Jarvis, you brought up something that you wanted to bring up on the podcast that I thought was at first Justin and we dismissed it immediately until you started to kind of explain it a little bit more, and then we were kind of like, okay, maybe this isn't such a bad idea. So you want to go ahead and start us off and get us in the primer? I think you're
Justin,
the best person to do that to start off.
Do you want to explain the Mariota Hurts comment and why I brought it up and you kind of shot it down? Do you want to explain your thoughts on that?
Well,
what went down?
Well, you know what? I mean, I shot it down just because I didn't realize what it would lead to, and like the bigger picture and what it meant we could really talk about. But it was, you asked if we wanted to talk about David Carr's comments about how Mariota should start over Jalen Hurts for the Eagles and that he would be more productive. And you said in the group chat, do you want to talk about that? And I said, no, because I was like, I don't even know how to argue the other side. But then you came back with kind of like a topic / question that applies to, I guess, current NFL teams. It applies to teams looking to draft players, but it was, I'm going to phrase this wrong. Crap. What do teams know? What's going on in their building that they know that obviously we don't know? Is that what the question was? Am I doing it right?
Yeah, it was essentially viewing things from the standpoint of like, if a team does something, what information do they have that you don't?
Right.
And so the thought that came to my mind was a couple years ago when it was JT Daniels and Stetson Bennett at Georgia. And JT Daniels was still considered like this tradesy prospect who, like, oh, he had a great freshman year at USC and he's getting all of this hype. There were a lot of people saying, like, why is Georgia starting Stetson Bennett? And I thought it was interesting from the aspect of, like, I know a lot of people were really hounding them on that, but it ended up being, at least from our perspective, the right decision to continue to start Stetson Bennett, and they won 2 national championships with him. So I think just the general idea of, like, if a team does something, again, what information do they have that you don't, and kind of how do you value that from the outside perspective, accepting, kind of realizing what you don't know about what's going on inside their building.
Right.
The reason why this is such a good topic to start to discuss is because we see it, especially in draft media, see it on social media, anything. But with a lot of draft analysts, there's always a lot of criticisms that come with watching the games, and people always sort of thinking, well, this guy's better because I watched him in the spring game and blah, 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 blah. There's definitely certain times when we see that teams make the wrong decision. But in the grand scheme of things, I would say it's like 95%. They're gonna play the right guy. They're gonna start the right guy, and it's all gonna be okay. It's very rare that you see them making the wrong decision on who's playing. So that's why I thought this would be something really good to get into, because it's easy as us watching the tape, watching, the limited, amount of information that we have to to observe and scout these guys and look at different things and understand the team sees them every day at practice. The team, works with them and sees them walking in the facilities. There's a whole lot more to it than just what we see on game day. A great example I could use is from this high school season that I just wrapped up here in Tennessee. We had a sophomore corner, and he had to play because of an injury. And if you had gone strictly off of the tape that you had watched his first 3-4 games, you would think that he was a lockdown, shutdown corner, because when they would try him, and it was usually later in the game because they didn't know much about him, he'd make a play on the ball, and it looked like, if you were going by the tape, he's an amazing corner. We got this guy that's been sitting there forever. Where's he been? But if you'd seen him at practice every day, you'd seen that he couldn't defend a post, he couldn't defend a go, and if you ran either one of those two on him, he was toast. But nobody knew that. So, that's kind of the thing, is like we're only seeing a part of the picture, and that's why I wanted to make sure that this got discussed today.
Right. And I mean, the biggest part of it is like and we do see it all the time, like draft media in general actually just criticizes everything teams do. I mean, from top to bottom. And like for David Carr to go on record, I mean, I don't know if he's just trolling at this point. I don't know. Like, because it's crazy. Like, first off, to say that Mariota, who, I mean, let's just be real. The guy, he's a washed up journeyman veteran. He's been everywhere. It's just, we know what he is. Washed up may be harsh. He's not a starter caliber quarterback in this league. He's been everywhere. Then you're comparing him to Jalen Hurts, who went to a Super Bowl last year, balled out in the Super Bowl. We've seen the way he's improved over his career. We've seen what kind of leader he is, what kind of teammate he is. He represents the city of Philadelphia right now. Like, that guy is everything. So now what David Carr is suggesting is, let's just completely F up the locker room. Because, I mean, you bench Jalen for a guy that's unproven, or that's proven to be not good. What would that do to the player morale, the locker room? The other coaches surely wouldn't be a fan of it. So for him to go to say something like that, that doesn't even require insider information. That doesn't even require you being in the building. That's just ignorant, and that's just craziness. But it also made me think, like, let's just pretend we don't know. Like, it's not as simple as this situation. It's often probably a lot more complex. But I think it does boil down to, yeah, the teams see these players practice every single day. They see how they interact with their teammates every single day, how they lead. A lot of it could just come down to, like, this guy's an asshole and this guy's not. And we're not going to give him a shot. Deuce Staley hated DeAndre Swift when he was at the Lions. And then they drafted Gibbs, traded Swift. We weren't there. We don't know who was who and what each other's issues were. Like, we don't know what Swift. All we know is Swift is super, super talented. He's proved that in Philadelphia now, but we don't know what was going on in that building. And so, I mean, I was even critical. Like, can you play your best running back? But it's like, yeah, I don't know what's going on there. I don't know if Swift is reacting negatively to something or vice versa. So there's just a lot of nuance that goes into it, as opposed to, hey, this guy's more athletic than this guy. We say this all the time. Like, it's not Madden. These are humans. So it's not just a matter of like comparing ratings. This guy's an 85. This guy's an 89. Put him in. It's a lot of the human element. And it sucks for us because we speculate so much and just pretend like we would make the right choice, but we don't really know what that right choice is because we're just never, ever there. And I mean, real quick. We talked about Justin Fields last week and how that offense is hilariously different every single week. And I see a lot of Bears fans like, why won't you do this? Why won't you do this? Why won't you run this with him, with this with him? Why won't you call a different game plan? Hey, man, Getsy and Eberflus have to see him practice every single day. So when they come out and throw 17 screens in the first half, I don't think they're doing it because they're stupid. I think they're doing it because they just straight up do not trust this guy. They've seen him practice for 3-4 years, and they're not really sure if he can process the field or run a game plan. There's so much more to it, but I think the benefit of the doubt usually has to go to the coaches and the people that are around these players all the time. You know what I mean? Whether like it or not, but I just think a lot of times we're not quick to accept that or, open to accept it.
Yeah, and I think the thing that really popped to me was this idea of, like, for instance, with Mariota and Hurts, like the concern that Carr had was, hey, Hurts isn't 100%. Maybe you kind of rest him up. You're kind of in the lead for the conference. Like, go ahead and just – but the question I always come to is if that's the right decision, why haven't they done it, right? Like, they have more information than anyone on the outside. They have more information than David Carr. They're with Hurts every day in the building. Like, if that was the right decision, why haven't they done it at that point? So that's the question I always come back to with something like that, whether it's like not benching Stetson Bennett for JT Daniels or anything along those lines. Like you said, it's not that they're stupid, right? Like, it's not like, you go out there and throw 17 screens with Justin Fields. You must just, not know how to use them. It's like they're probably seeing things that we don't have access to, that hidden information, and that's why they're doing that.
The only reason that we're having this conversation about Jalen Hurts too, and potentially, I think the only reason this comes up is because they just lost 42-19 to the 49ers. I think that's literally the only reason that we're having this. And so that's the other thing that's funny about the whole thing is it's very difficult to beat a good team twice. It's even harder to beat a great team twice. There's no doubt Philadelphia's a great team. And I'm not saying this because I got the Eagles thing hanging up over me. I'm saying it because they're a great team. And, if I'm going to lose to the 49ers, I'd much rather lose to them, figure out how I lose to them in the regular season as opposed to in the playoffs. And I think everybody in Philadelphia feels the same way right now.
Yeah. The advantage is always to the team that won or that lost. It always is. In any sport I've ever played my entire life, I'd rather lose and, because when you win, it's hard to figure out, well, what could we do better? Like, we did it. We did it better. It's like a boxer. You throw a punch. Now, you have to understand how they're going to counter that punch, but then your opponent's going to counter that punch. But now you have to look forward and say, I need to counter my own moves because he's going to react this way and come back at me a certain way. So now I need to counter what he thinks I'm going to do. And then it gets kind of that paralysis by overanalysis thing where it's easier to just lose straight up and be like, we're going to fix that, and that. You know what I mean? And yeah, I think you're right. San Francisco is a lot better than Philly, I think. But I think Philly has that advantage of, like, if we see you again, we kind of know some things that you don't know. They're better, John. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, John.
I'm going to disagree with that statement, not because I'm an Eagles fan, not because I love Jalen Hurts, but just because I think we know too much about Kyle Shanahan at this point. So,
yeah. Yeah, it'll be a good rematch.
They're not better. Not as long as Kyle Shanahan's leading them. They're not better.
It'll be a good rematch, that's for sure. Anyways,
do you guys got anything else that you wanted to add on that point?
My brain went blank, but I feel like I had something. Mark, I was like,
I think we're in the same boat on brain going blank. Other than like I said, the aspect of just I always try to play that game of what information is in someone else's head. And we could kind of segue this into like the team check boxes of like teams versus media, because I think very much a lot of media people view it from the perspective like, what did I see? Like I watched, let's say 3-4 games on a guy. What's my opinion? Where does he stack on my own personal board? Rather than let me get into the head of these different teams and try to figure out how they're going to view it. And so, like I said, I always love playing that game of like, if I try to take that outside perspective, where do I end up going with my line of thinking?
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess. Oh, that's what I was thinking earlier. Sorry. This does apply not only to like NFL teams, but to the draft as well. We see it every year. I mean, and this is going to segue also into what we are going to talk about next. But as far as like, what do teams in the building, what do they know in the building that we don't know on the outside? When a team drafts a player, like I don't think the media or a lot of guys realize they're sending scouts nationwide all year to practices, to meet coaches, to meet teammates, to meet family, to meet friends, everything. So when you see a guy drop, it's not like, oh, they got to steal. Like these teams passed him up. How dare? No, bro. There's so much. Like they know stuff that we don't. I remember Dalvin Cook's year. I was working with Draft Bible and Rick Saratella at the time. Rick Saratella is so hooked up to a lot of people. I mean, he's been in the industry forever. He knows a ton of people. He knew Dalvin Cook's agent. We found out a lot of stuff about Dalvin Cook ahead of the draft, about who he was hanging around with, his habits, all this crazy stuff. And it's like, okay, the talent is first round. The head on this kid's shoulders appear to be first round. He seems like he's got his act together. He knows what he wants to do. He knows his priorities. But there's just too much that the teams that dug into him knew. And so it's that weighing that risk reward of, okay, the media won't understand it, and we can't, and the teams aren't going to publicly blast all this information about the red flags with this kid. So he's going to drop, and everyone's going to criticize. Everyone's going to act like, every team made a mistake, or anyone who leaks a little info is an idiot. Like it happened with Jalen Carter. Anyone who thought they knew anything was like, how dare you? And it comes out, this guy was in a high-speed car crash, blah, blah, blah. There's more to it. But with Dalvin Cook, it was like some of the things I heard, I'm like, that's outrageous. And the teams will know that, and it'll never get out. And sure enough, he drops to the second round. But it's just that like we're talking about, there's so much more that goes into drafting a player or playing an NFL player than we will ever know, unless we know. But that's the thing. It's like a lot of times you don't know what you don't know. So you're just kind of on the outside like, yeah, I'll take what I can get. And after that, who knows? And like medical, same way. They go to these players go to the combine, or they have, injuries during the year that don't really come out. And so we hear like, oh, this guy has a red flag medically. And it's like, well, I saw him play all year. He played on a torn ACL. You know what I mean? Like now a team's not going to draft him in the first or second round when he's got a torn ACL. Like there's a lot more that he's going to have surgery, or he's going to have to sit up. So, I mean, I don't know. It's definitely hard to be silent and just kind of let the chips fall where they fall. But it's necessary to make yourself less crazy throughout the year.
Yeah, there's two things I would throw in here, and looking at my notes, there's a thing I threw down called kill criteria, which is essentially like if you were to view, like, let's say a guy has a really, really bad medical, or he's got some really, really bad off the field stuff. Some teams are just going to take him off the board entirely. You're not going to see media guys just pulling a guy off the board, right? Like even if he's got baggage that is really, really bad, it's still okay. Well, we'll just push him down to 6th, 7th round, so on and so forth. It's not like he just gone, versus for teams, that's how they treat it. They're not going to spend that type of money and invest anything in a guy who has severe issues. And number two, again, along those lines of like people from the media perspective see these guys fall and go, oh, it's such a great hit and this and that. Again, it goes back to why would teams let them fall if it's that great value, right? There's a comic out there I saw a while ago, and it was like, it's like all your friends jump off the bridge, essentially like it might be rational for you to do the same thing, because did all your friends suddenly go crazy, or is the bridge on fire? Like, if everyone's jumping off the bridge, what's more likely? Right. Do you think the people who stayed at the bridge, something great happened to them? Like, no, it's like, okay, everyone who jumped lived and everyone who stayed died. But I think it goes to that same thing. So if you want, we can get into those check boxes that you want to talk about.
Yeah. Damn. Jenny?
So, yeah, we wanted to talk about NFL checklists and how every team has them, usually position dependent. Background is usually one, but Justin, you wanted to take the lead on this, so
I mean, I guess so. Sorry, my brain. I feel like I'm just catching up with life today. So this kind of goes with what we just talked about, and it's partially like what teams know that we'll never know, but it's also we see it every year where it's like media scouts a lot of times have like these players they fall in love with, and they're so high on, and I would take him first round. You can't let him drop. Blah 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 blah. Okay, what I've learned harshly throughout the years being in this industry, looking like a fool many times, feeling like an idiot many times, is NFL teams do far more thorough research on these players, and they also have far more that goes into drafting them. And it's a matter of they need production. Some teams need a certain position to have these measurables, or not at all, or you're not on our board. Have to have them start a certain amount of years. Have to have them have certified testing, whether that be pro day or combine. I heard one team that wanted combine players only. They didn't trust pro day numbers. Even when they sent their guys out there, they said it meant less to them than the combine. Off-field stuff has to be perfectly clean, squeaky clean. They need multiple years of production. And so teams have basically what we were talking about earlier. They have checklists where we have 9 boxes. These guys have to check 7 of these 9 or whatever, and it goes into their overall grade. And it's not always about just having the elite talent. I forget what show it was on ESPN or NFL Network or something. It was like 2 or 3 years ago. But I remember they went inside the war room of an actual team. I forget what team it was. But they were showing for each player they had evaluated, they had like cards on the board. And they had color-coded cards on certain like the checklist had certain colors on them, and they needed to meet certain criteria. But it was like some guys, like I wish I remembered now, but it was like there were some guys on there that were the same position, and they had like negatives on it, and it said like words next to it, like production or this like one game or something only. And it's like that's how thorough these guys get, where they need to have everything lined up perfectly, and it goes into this overarching grade, and that is how they really stack these guys up. And so the smallest thing can kind of derail a player's grade. I remember Bill Parcells, he has the quarterback checklist, right? He has 4 things a quarterback had to have. He had to be a senior. He had to be a graduate. He had to have 23 wins and something else. All I know is Patrick Mahomes. Do you guys know how many wins he had his junior year when he declared for the draft?
I'm going to guess like 10.
He had 5. Patrick Mahomes, the year that he had – and Bill Parcells has to have you be a 3-year starter. Well, guess what? Patrick Mahomes, 2-year starter. He won nothing. His junior year where he declared, he won 5 games, was not bowl eligible. And so he would be off an entire team's list now because he didn't fit their criteria.
Wait. So if he's a 2-year starter and he won 5 games –
5 games his junior year.
His junior year.
Yeah.
How many did he win his sophomore year?
I don't remember that. He won.
I want to say it was like 5.
Let me see.
Because Texas Tech was always that middling 5-7, 6-6 team.
So Mahomes' sophomore year, he won 7 games. Then he regressed and won 5 his junior year.
Which wasn't obviously all on Patrick, but
right. But that's the point is, like, Parcells would have said, nah, we can't take this guy. No way. He didn't win. He wasn't a 3-year starter. He didn't graduate, and he didn't win. So as stupid as that might sound, and as silly as that might sound to some people and a lot of media scouts, that's the reality of some NFL teams. I don't think a lot of them operate with this system, and they're not that archaic. But I've talked to a lot of scouts at combines and events, and I'm like, that's crazy. The Budda Baker year, I wrote an article about it. Budda Baker was a 2nd-round pick out of Washington, right? One of the best safeties in our game right now. I talked to a scout, and I won't name what team he was from, and he said we would never draft Budda Baker ever in a million years. He's not big enough for us. He simply does not fit our size, our height, weight thresholds. And they said for a guy that's going to play in our back end, he has to be much bigger. He has to be like 15 pounds bigger, and he's got to be at least 3 inches taller. And I'm like,
that's got to be Seattle.
It was not Seattle. It was not Seattle, actually. But I'm like, dude, that's crazy. Like, he's not even on their board. Like, well, I don't know. I don't know if he ended up on their board or not. But all I know is, like, he's not a guy they would consider drafting where most people would have drafted him. And so that's, the reality of it is these teams have these lists. And if you don't fit certain things, you don't fit certain things, and you're done.
I was going to say maybe they'd consider him as like a special teams guy, but if they're that harsh about the size of their safeties, they probably are harsh about the size of their special teams guys too. So
Right.
he probably doesn't have a home at all there. That's
well,
why I think so many.
No, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, I know some teams do this thing where they have a fall point, and it's like, if this player falls to this point, we'll take him. Right. So, like, let's say the media has this guy all first round, whatever. This team will say he not for us, but they'll say past pick 79 or something, or past this certain point. Yeah, we'll grab him. We'll grab him. And it's worth the value to us at that point. But before that, he is not someone that we would spend that high of a pick on. So, every year we hear like, oh, this guy was a crazy steal, blah, whatever. Will Levis just last year went in the second round. I don't know much about what happened there. I don't know what teams. John probably has far more of, his ear to the ground with this kind of thing. I don't know what happened, but now we already hear like he was a steal. And I'm like, first off, it's too early. Second, I don't know what teams found out about Will. I don't know much, but I just know like it happened for a reason,
With
John,
Levis,
you look like you said
specifically.
I was waiting.
No, with Levis specifically, it was there were a couple things. And number one was he was just arrogant at times, very arrogant during interviews. Just thought they were a little bit worried about that. The other thing with him was when I was at the Music City Bowl, and I was talking to scouts there. The question was, why is he not playing? And I think that there's two different schools of thought, two main schools of thought in the NFL right now. And what I found is that it's evenly divided between the younger and the older scouts. It's about, the difference is probably about 15 years. The younger scouts all think that it's smart to sit out a bowl game, don't want you getting hurt, blah, blah, blah. The older scouts think that you gotta play.
Gotta put up for your team.
And well, yeah, exactly. But it was a good question when you've got, a situation where a quarterback speaking arrogantly, holding himself up to this threshold, saying that he's there, and you're not sure about that. And then on top of that, while he's doing all this, he's not going to play his bowl game. I think all those things sort of combined, because there were guys that I was talking to, at the combine, and the younger scout generation was talking about, oh yeah, he's going to go top 5.
Yeah,
he's going to be a top 5 pick.
Well, I think a lot of people.
And then there were other guys, like the older guys that I was talking to, that were saying 3rd, 4th round pick. So I think that's where they kind of met in the middle based on everything that happened. But yeah, he had some arrogance, and that's another big thing too with temperament. I think the temperament and how you're going to fit in the locker room, that's another thing that's on a lot of these checklists.
Yeah.
You want to bring in the right guy. You don't want to bring in somebody who's going to throw off everything. You got chemistry that you're trying to build, and that's a huge part of team building, is how well does everybody get along. Carson Wentz had a lot of great talent, but the way that it was described to me about him, if you weren't a Christian and you didn't like hunting, he didn't know how to connect with you.
I can see that. Yeah.
That's crazy. That's crazy when you think about it, because
I remember
this is the leader of your team.
I remember at the combine, he was talking about his Bible study in one of the interviews. They were like, what do you like to do on Friday nights? He's like, I lead a Bible study, and that's all I do. I'm like, that's cool, but, yeah, you're going to be in a diverse locker room with a lot of people from different backgrounds. I mean, you might have to expand on that, buddy. Like, some things might have to change. Go bowling or something. But he did feel like that type of guy who might be a little kind of one track and couldn't really expand out. But yeah, I mean, that's it. It's like that scene from Step Brothers when Seth Rogen is interviewing both for that work at the sporting goods store, and he's like, to be real, he's like, I'm just looking for 2 dudes to hang out with 8 hours a day. He's like, you're not weird, right? And they're like, no. And then he farts, and he's like, I don't know about that. And then they don't get the job. But that's really what it boils down to, is like, you're interviewing these players. Like, are you normal? Can you just hang out for like, can you fit the locker room? We obviously know you're talented. We know you're going to be drafted. But I think a lot of it has to come down to that human element. Like, can you fit what we do here? And like we see with Dan Campbell, they drafted Jack Campbell, which a lot of people thought was a reach, myself included. But I'm like, that's the most culture pick I've ever seen in my life. Aiden Hutchinson, same thing. I feel like he was overdrafted. Some people do, some people don't. But either way, you're like, bro, these guys fit Dan Campbell. They fit the Lions. They fit the locker room. They fit the culture. They'll never that coaching staff will never question these guys' love for football or their work ethic. You know what I mean? And I think that's a big part of it too, just fitting people who want to do what you want to do and see that big picture. So, I mean, yeah, a lot of times I feel like people are overdrafted or underdrafted, but that probably comes into play is their fit as human beings too. John? He made it. I see you made a face.
I was wondering if John was going to take it there. A couple of things I would throw out, and one would be going back to the aspect of checklist, right? Is like, what's the purpose of anything on that checklist? Like, for instance, I pulled up that Parcells checklist, and so like the rules being, he must be a senior because you need time and maturity to develop into a good professional quarterback. He must be a graduate because you want someone who takes his responsibility seriously. And just going through that list, you look at it and you go, okay, why does that not apply today? Right? Like, it's an outdated checklist, to be honest. I think both of you guys would probably agree with that it's like, you're not going to find, okay, he's a senior graduate, 3-year starter, 23 wins. Usually guys that are highly, highly talented just declare as a junior. That's just the way the market is right now. And so what doesn't fit going forward with that? I know a guy we're going to talk about here, Xavier Leggett. You wanted to talk about Gam, and you want to talk about, okay, he's on the older side, right? Some teams are sticklers about older prospects, but you look at, for instance, the fact that this is a COVID year class. How does that impact how we view the age of players? Are teams more, accepting with that? Or I think that's what makes it interesting is the dynamic of like what the value of each point of a checklist is changes each year as the league evolves and new things kind of come into the system.
Right. And with Leggett specifically, it's going to be, I think my question, like if I'm a GM or if I'm a scout, I'm going into that building and I'm going to ask, how in the world did a height, weight, speed freak like this guy, how did he have, so he's a 5th year at South Carolina for everybody that doesn't know. He's a 5th year player at South Carolina. His freshman year, he had 80 yards. His sophomore year, 113. Junior, 63. Senior, 167. That's yardage per year, right? That's an entire season. This year, he's got 71 catches for 1,255 yards and 7 touchdowns. What in the world happened, right? But we see every week, we're like, dude, if you knew nothing going in, nothing about his backstory, anything, his age, you just watch the film and say, this guy is an elite prospect. Like, that's a fast man. That's a big dude. That's a coordinated dude. What can't he do? But I think a lot of us, like all 3 of us, kind of know more about it. So, he's not necessarily on our top 5 receiver lists or top 3. But yeah, if I'm digging into why these South Carolina coaches didn't play him more. What happened over the first 4 years that you kept this talent off the field? Is it just Rattlers having like I don't even know. I don't even know how I would justify or what questions I would ask going in. But I'd have to come up with a good list of like, tell me what happened. So no matter what, Leggett is going to have that production box not checked off, right? You can't change that. But I think now you got to get context and figure out like the justification for it and ask what really changed from last year or the other 4 years to this year. Because I know, John, you said at one point like he's a 3rd rounder for you, or I don't know if you think that's where he's going to go. But I'd like to hear. I mean, you maybe have done more digging. You always do a lot more background on these guys than I do, so you might have more of a bigger picture on him because I don't know much about him.
I don't have anything on him.
Oh, okay. I don't either. I don't
have anything on him that I've done background. Okay. Yeah, no, not background stuff. Though I'm gonna look at one place that I hadn't looked before.
We talked about it, John, because I know we brought his name up, and you said you thought he might not go any earlier than like late day 2, or it might have been late round 2. But either way, you thought he was going to be a little bit further down, just because the aspect of it's like, why did he not play? And it's just that looming question of like, how do you answer that? And is there a reasonable answer? Like, I don't know what answer that I would get that I would like. Does that make sense? Like, what answer could I have that would make me happy that he didn't play? Is it the coaching staff just wasn't a big fan of him? He couldn't process the information. Like, what answer could I possibly have that would make me feel more comfortable with that other than
Like what's your acceptable answer?
yeah, I just don't know what I'd be looking for that would be cool. Like, okay, cool, you didn't pick up on the routes you're supposed to run or whatever. Or, oh, you had trouble with your hands. Like, I'd be curious to know like what caused the progression. But I also would wonder like, do I have some concern to why he would like revert back? Like now that we've seen him in this fully like, if you want to call it progressed form, why would he go backwards? If that makes sense.
Right. And I mean, I'm sure a lot of that will come when they interview him in person.
Well, the player, if you remember, that I put him to was Cordero Patterson.
Okay.
You know, and it's because he kind of fits that same sort of build. He's got that same sort of skill set, special teams guy that, you know, he's obviously going to be able to play there, but he's a playmaker. Get him to space. And Patterson, you know, I think he had that one big year with Tennessee where he pops out on the scene. It was just a 1 year, and then he goes first round. Yeah. Now the other difference too was his third year. This is Leggette's fifth year, you know, so that's concerning. But yeah, and then we had talked about it. I know Justin, you weren't here; you were out that week, but like he has raw ability, but at the same time, like he popped in the bowl games the last couple years before he became a starter. You know, whether there were players that were down, he came up. So he popped. He looked really good in the Duke's Mayo Bowl against North Carolina in 21. He looked really good against Notre Dame in 22. Yeah, that goes right back to okay, so what the fuck happened in the spring? Why were you not starting at the beginning of the next year? You know, that's my big question. You know, so I can't come to terms with that personally, and I think that's why I said I really think he's going to go. I don't see him going before the end of the second round. I don't. And then when you take that also into the fact that you've got just at the X receiver position, insane depth. You know, or Z. I said X Z receiver position. You know, Harrison Jr., Odunze, Neighbors.
Just the receiver position in general is deep. So, yeah.
There's so many guys, I don't know if they're going to come out or not. Xavier Worthy could come out. Abuka could come out. Mario Williams could come out. You know, Wells said he's going back. He's going in the transfer portal, the other South Carolina receiver. Yep. Cowing, Baker, Corley, Jalen Polk, Roman Wilson, Corey Crooms, Zachary Franklin, Lad McConkey. Like, there's just so many guys there where it's like, okay, so where does he fit in all these players? You know, where do I draw the line and I say, okay, I like him better than this guy? That's a very difficult question to answer.
And not only do I like him better, but am I accepting of like whatever the backstory is for that? Like Mark said, what's the answer? I'll accept for why he had 4 years of doing literally almost nothing, and then it pops. You know, if he was like an average player, it'd be like less concerning. It's like, yeah, he just, you know, he got buried on the depth chart. But the fact that he's had such a big year and been like Spencer Rattler's main target is more concerning. You're like, oh, we've seen he's really good. We've seen how much they could have used him, and they didn't. Something's up. Where, you know, you see like a guy on Bama get buried on the depth chart, and he's an elite talent, and he gets to the top, you know, comes out his junior, senior year after a huge year, and it's like, we're not really questioning that because Bama's Bama, and the SEC has depth out the ass, especially like the top teams. But South Carolina's not that way, so it'll be very interesting to see what happens with that.
One thing I wanted to throw out here, and this, like, I think, how to put this, we talk about these check boxes, right? And so every guy has different check boxes you want to hit, and most guys aren't going to hit all of them, right? And so I think it's interesting to view from the standpoint of, like, obviously, like, it not having that age or multi-year production, but he has the SEC. He's huge. He's got great athleticism. Another guy you could look at for, like, how weird you can get into like these check boxes is like Deuce Vaughn last year. So Deuce Vaughn was 5'5", 179, ran a 4.56. Like I would have taken him off right there. I think a lot of people would. But then you go, okay, he was P5. He ran for almost 1,500 yards 2 back-to-back seasons. He's got experience as a returner. Like you're gonna have a give and take on every single checkbox, and that's why like I don't like to treat it as like there's some certain like absolutist checkbox like for every team. Every team's gonna have different ones that they kind of come with.
Well, it's like Clyde
what's interesting?
Edwards-Helaire. Go ahead.
You bring up Vaughn specifically, which is an interesting one to bring up because the only reason he goes in the 5th round is because his dad's a coach on that team. I'm just saying.
Do you think he would have gone UDFA if it weren't for that?
Absolutely.
Interesting.
What's he doing right now?
Not much. But then it makes you.
He's on the practice squad. That's where he is. He played 2 games this year.
But
it's
then
because he's 5'5".
Like Clyde Edwards-Helaire, who's 5'6", 200, runs a 4.65. Yeah, like right there, like Mark said, I don't even want to consider drafting you. I won't. You're off my board. He goes in the 1st round. So it makes you think, was the Kansas City Chiefs only box that they needed was like, or 2 boxes, productive and played for a good team? Like, where's the balance there? Because he fit.
We
no
talked to
traditional
Joe
box.
Burrow, and they said he was great.
Yeah,
he said he's an amazing running back.
He's slower than my father, and he's smaller too. So he's going to go for 1st round. And we've seen like he's had a tough go in Kansas City. He's gotten. I mean, Pacheco's clearly the number 1. We rarely see reps from Clyde Edwards, but it does make you think. Like, do teams adjust? I guess, Mark, this is a question for you. Do you think teams would adjust their board for certain positions or make exceptions for certain players? Or do some things just carry that much weight? Was his time at LSU winning a national championship for Edwards-Helaire, for instance, and being so productive, did that carry so much weight that trades just didn't matter? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Let me look. I'm actually curious. I can't remember what his production was in college for like how much he was using the passing game, because that would be my thought. Is just they wanted a guy. They were trying to go towards pass heavy. So, yeah, so 55 receptions, 453 yards, 1 TD. Had that big year. It's interesting. I think a lot of teams are willing to they'll kind of like offset it, right? Like if they have certain compensatory traits. So like I think of like the Colts, and where I think it's with the first pick series, they talked about Kenny Moore. Even though he's a smaller corner on paper, like in terms of his height, they were fine with him because they're like, cool, he's got 33-inch arms, right? So you might have a guy who's a little bit smaller, but they have offsetting traits that kind of allow them. So you could think, size versus speed. You can have that offset. There's a bunch of different ways you could go with that. Obviously, some teams are a lot more heavy on, hey, the guy played in the SEC. We saw him against the highest level of competition. He looked good in that regard. I don't know if there's one catch-all answer to that, though. Like, I think it's just so dependent on each team has their different boxes that they're going to hit. Like, my thought was to kick it back to you and ask you, like, what boxes would you have? Like, you could pick any position, let's say running back. Like, what boxes would you want in a running back, whether it's production or level of competition or speed or so on and so forth?
Running back's hard because I already don't want to take one in the 1st round, right? Like
I don't mean necessarily just like in the 1st round. Let's just say to get drafted. Like the guy can't be 170. Like he's got to be bigger than that, right?
Right.
So where would you fall on like what would your cutoff lines be? Let's go like if level of comp, height, weight, speed, production.
Like I would say if I'm drafting a Power 5 guy, or I would say this, I want to draft a Power 5 guy. I don't want him to be below 190, for instance. If I'm drafting a non-Power 5 guy, I would probably say he needs to be bigger. Like I don't want to. The Power 5 is a real bump, right? It's a real bump. You want to see him against the best competition, and then you can kind of live with some other things. And I can say, all right, he's 195. He's more of a slasher. Can he catch the ball? Yes. Was he productive? Yes. Cool. Did he test? I think what's become more important for me throughout the years is I think when I first started this kind of shit, I was like, I don't need to see him test. Like I saw him on the field, he's fast. And it's like, yeah, you're dumb. You're naive. Like it matters. It matters a lot because why it matters is not just that you can say, ooh, I see he's fast. But and I learned this from you, Mark, early on. I learned this from Kent Lee Platt, who comes out with the cool RAS scores. It's not just a matter of now I can see he's fast and quantify it. I can compare him to tons of players from the past, and I can kind of put all the data together and see, like, is he an outlier? Like, I like him. And that's what we're talking about. Like, teams do the research. Teams have the checklist for a reason. It's not just a matter of, do I like him anymore? It's, shoot, this corner is 5'11" and ran a 4.65. Has that ever been successful in the NFL? No. Well, but he's stuck with this guy. He's stuck with this guy. He can cover. Like, yeah, but the NFL is a different animal, and it's literally never happened ever. You know what I mean? So now you're saying, and we talked about this in the group chat, it's like, all right, I have this opinion that is pretty outlandish, and I'm the only one. And I think this 4.65, 5'11" corner can work. No one else seems to think that. So now I have to ask myself, how valuable is this opinion that I have? Because it's the only one. It's the only one that's like it. And I forget where I was heading with that. But yeah, I think, like, okay, for instance, this year, Cooper DeJean. How do I pronounce his name, John? Is it DeJean or DeJean?
Pretty sure it's DeJean.
Cooper DeJean. So he's the Iowa cornerback / safety. Tore his ACL early November. Is that correct? Tore his ACL.
Yep. Correct.
Okay, so for him, he was already a tough study for me. And I'm like, all right, this is going to be an interesting eval. First off, he's a white guy in the secondary. Red flag. Like, straight up red flag. I'm like, it just doesn't happen much, right? Like, it never happens. Look around in history. Look around in the current NFL. Who do we have? Harrison Smith and not many other ones, right, that are high level. So I'm like, all right, white guy. Now I'm like, all right, he's a big dude. He's like 6'2", 205, 210. How good are his hips really? Can he play corner? Is he a safety? I'm watching tape, right? All right, I'm watching him against Big Ten teams. These Big Ten passing games are trash. Even the top teams this year were trash. Penn State has a rookie or a freshman. That passing game was a disaster. Kyle McCord was awful for Ohio State. Granted, I'm seeing Cooper DeJean play, they didn't even play them. The point is, I'm watching him play bad Big Ten offenses. So it's even harder to really see what he can do because they're not playing. He's not facing volume passing games. He's not really facing quality. So it's just a lot of things on the checklist that I'm like, I don't know. Like, there's some things I need to see. There's certain types of reps and coverage I haven't seen. I'll see if he tests elite. Not going to test now. At least I could say, all right, he runs 4.35. He jumps out of the gym. I'm going to bank on this athlete. I'm going to bank on this crazy elite athlete. Now we're not going to get to see those numbers. So sure, I'm sure he's athletic. I'm sure he's fast, but I can't put that down on paper. And for a lot of teams, that's a huge freaking deal because they can sell that to a GM. The GM can sell that to himself by saying, look at this. Look at how good he tested. Now they can't do that. So now they just have to hope that their eye test was good enough on top of all the other things that are kind of already going against this kid playing in like the Big Ten and not getting to see a lot of things we like to see. So he's one of the ones where I'm like, I think the media loves him.
Is he? I don't think he's coming out.
Is he not? I thought I've heard only rumors that like he's coming.
So this is the first year that he's draft eligible.
Yeah.
I saw him last year and it was Music City Bowl in person. And I was walking down the field before the game, and I was taking some of those like videos, that you take of the guys warming up, get a look at their body type. And as I'm like, who's this number 3 guy? Like this guy,
yeah,
he was back there catching kicks.
Yeah.
I'm like, who is this guy? Like he's got some explosion. He's got some pop. And so I took a video of him. It was Cooper DeJean. Yeah. And he had a phenomenal game against Kentucky, too. And I was sitting there going, okay, yeah, he's legit. The other thing, too, is he's athletic.
Oh, yeah.
And it's not because of the work that he did on defense. It's the special teams work that he's done. The problem with knowing that he's athletic like that becomes... Well, now we're dealing with a guy that, is he just a pure athlete or is he a reactive athlete? And on defense, I'd much rather have a reactive athlete than a pure athlete. I think he's reactive. I'm pretty sure he is. But and
it's hard to tell in the Big Ten. I
don't know for a fact, but I don't think he's coming out.
Well, that's a relief. because I felt like my eval was going to be so incomplete on a super talented guy, and I already don't have access to things the NFL teams do, and now I have to rely on whatever I can find out, and it's not much. So,
Cam, I have a few things that kind of come to mind in that regard of like you mentioned if you don't have like that testing, like obviously the testing's not the end all be all, right? Like that it has to match the tape. If the guy runs 4.3 but he looks 4.6, like okay, don't really care. But one thing that I would say is like number one, if I was with the team, be like, did we miss on the athlete? If like let's say we think 4.4 and he comes out and he runs 4.6, like were we just wrong? Like were our eyes wrong? Or is he different? Like, let's say a guy gets injured. Like, let's say DeJean somehow were to get healthy enough to where he could run, and he goes out there and he runs 4.6. It's like, did we miss, or is he now a different guy physically post recovery? And then that kind of goes to like, how do you implement like using stuff like GPS to kind of offset and figure out like what sources can you use to determine what type of athlete a guy is if you don't have those testing numbers, or if they're kind of skewed based on he was injured or something like that.
well, I mean, if that's the case, the other question is like, why do you run? Is he getting bad advice? Is this how did he feel 100%, or did he know he wasn't 100%? And if he knew he wasn't 100%, why do you run? So then you ask, at least in my mind, then I go to like this spiral of like so many more questions of what is really going on here. And then I mean, I think that's the part where you kind of get that paralysis by overanalysis, where it's just like, I don't know what to do. And you already know me, Mark. I'm not the guy to like reason through all that. My brain doesn't work that fast.
Well, I was going to ask, like, what do you mean by process by overanalysis? Like, what would get you hung up there?
Well, like I said, okay, so like let's say that scenario happens, right? Cooper DeJean is like, oh, guys, I'm healthy, combine, and he runs 4.65. Is that how fast you are? Are you recovering from your injury? Did you run because you felt 100%? And if you weren't 100%, why'd you run? Who's giving you bad advice? Like all those questions would go through my mind, and I feel like all the answers could be different, and then I'm like, what am I looking for here? Like, what would I be like you said earlier, what am I okay with? How do I even balance like what I'm about to hear? Like, you know what I mean? I remember Jarvis Landry, he ran horrible at the combine when he came out.
4.77 or something like that. Yeah.
And I think he said he pulled up on his hamstring or something, right? That
Something
was
like
that.
that.
But then like I don't know. It felt like he didn't make that as public as I would have. Like if I know I'm fast and I run a 4.77, that's the only thing I'm going to talk about. That's the only thing I'm going to say. And it felt like it was very like you didn't hear about it. And I remember I had to do some digging. Like, what the hell? What happened? And I remember Rick Saratella was even like, I think we're hearing something about his hamstring. I'm like, then say it. Only talk about it. Like, I think you're slow now. I already didn't think you were that fast on tape. But are you a 4.77 guy? And then, I think he went to his pro day and ran a lot faster. But it was still like pro day numbers are always inflated. So that's not, I think it was still in like the 4.5s or something. So I'm like, that's not great. He could run a whole 0.1 faster, at the pro day because of the stopwatch timers. It was just one of those things where it's like, how do I balance all this info? How do I quantify all this data when I kind of need to ask you guys some questions? You know what I mean? Like I need to interview Jarvis and figure out what happened. And for me, like every year, that's part of the thing. Is like I just feel like I'm asking too many questions, and inevitably I'm asking the wrong ones here and there. And that's why I got you this year, Mark. So hopefully that'll change.
I think the question I would pose, funny enough, would be that what's your intent? Like if you're with a team, it's like the way I view it for with a team would be what's the risk tolerance, right? Like if a guy runs 4.65, like he can give me every excuse of like, oh I pulled a hammy or like I wasn't fully recovered or what. Like at what point am I okay with a 4.65? Or at what point am I okay with him not running and I don't have verified numbers, right? Like post injury. So I think that's a very different perspective to take than like a media perspective, where media perspective is if I drop this guy, like let's say I have him top 15 and then he doesn't run and like I'm spooked by him, I drop him down to like 50 and then he goes top 15 because teams are okay with it. Like, do I look like an ass? Right, it's a very different mentality based on wherever you're standing, whether you're with a team or your meter or whatever your goal is. So I think that's where I would go with like what questions would I ask and what would I kind of like try to point it at from there.
Right. I always think this, like every single year, I always think An incomplete is better on the checklist. An incomplete is better than a negative. Like if I don't know, like T. Higgins, am I right, John? T. Higgins did not run a 40 his year that he came out. I'm pretty sure he didn't, and everyone was speculating like, it's because he's slow. And I'm like, I don't know. And I remember thinking like, well, I'd rather let people think, like guess, than tell them yes, I'm slow. Like if
he ran, by the way, 4.59 pro day.
That was
COVID year. That was the last pro day before they shut it all down.
Okay,
but he skipped combine.
Yeah. So when he skipped the combine, everyone was up in arms, like, is he slow? And I'm like, I don't think he's fast, but I think he'd rather be in an environment where he can kind of have his people control it and put up a better number inevitably on the hand time than go to the combine, run a 4.7, and be like, well, I'll improve it at the pro day, because like that's not. Like I said, I'd rather just let people guess and have an incomplete than tell them straight up like I'm slow. And I mean, even for me, as like a
COVID year, the year that like Cam Dantzler,
yes, ran
so
the slow.
COVID year, the year that Cam Dantzler ran the 4.24.
Oh,
yeah, but the agents dropped the video where he ran the 4.24. No. The agents dropped the video because we were in COVID lockdowns, and it was him running a 40, and it was supposed at 4.24. And everybody was looking at it going, yeah, this is BS.
Wasn't it sped up or something?
Like that COVID year was wild. That's what just made me think of.
Yeah.
Yeah, it had to have been sped up.
I think it was.
Were they like, they sit there and they clock it. They just clock it and get like a 4.24 to show up, and then they get the video to match it. Is basically what they did.
Yeah. No, I forgot it. COVID year was crazy because that was the year like Micah Parsons and Jamar Chase sat out, and then we have oh my god.
Yeah, I got something I would throw out real quick too, and I think it goes to like the no number.
The LSU receivers all ran 4.3s.
Yeah, that was that year, and we're all like, can we trust any of this stuff? Anyway, I'm sorry.
So when you think of like, let's say you don't have a number, what happens when it's a player you like, and what happens if it's a player you don't like? If you think a guy's going to run like crap and he doesn't put a number, what do you think? And if you think he's going to run real well and doesn't put a number, what do you think?
I let my confirmation bias run wild, and I just boost my guy.
Yeah. And that's exactly what I'm thinking of. Is like every team based on like, well, it's individual scouts too, right? Is they're going to think, oh, he didn't run a number, but yeah, he looked plenty fine to me. He looked fast on tape. Or if you're on the other end, you're like, that guy doesn't look too fast to me. He's hiding something. He didn't want to run because he's going to run like crap. So it gives you more maneuverability, I think, to where the people that like you are going to use that in their corner and be like, oh, we don't have a number, but he looked fast. And people who don't like you, it's the other way. And then you don't have to really like have that. But if you go out there and like, you just shit the bed at your pro day, it's like everyone's like, yeah, you just ran like crap, dude. I can't argue for you now. You ran a 4.7 as a receiver. Like, it's over. I'm sorry.
Well, I think the other problem like I have specifically is like I've talked to a good amount of people in the know. I've talked to scouts, and they will always say like, fast guys run fast. Good testers test good. And I'm like, okay, cool. So then when a guy doesn't do something, I'm like, he would only not do it because he's bad at it or because he's slow. You know what I mean? And so I have like that mindset where I kind of like embedded that old information of like, well, if he's fast, why wouldn't he run? And I think there's probably a lot of truth to that, but I do think there's some circumstances where it's like you can get burned if that's the way you think 100% of the time. Clearly, T. Higgins was like the first one I remember where I was like, oh, I really like the tape. I really like the player, but I don't think he's that fast. Then he puts that, and I'm like, shoot, this is a player I really like. I was actually feeling pretty objective that year. I'm like, I just want to see. I just want to know like what he was actually going to run for my own eval, and it kind of frustrated me. But sometimes there's a guy that your confirmation bias is just like right on the money, and you're totally okay with just writing him off or boosting him up or whatever. This year for me, Keon Coleman is that guy. I think he's slow, and then randomly like I'm watching tape and I'm like, that's fast, but I can't figure him out. And I'm really excited to see what he runs this year at the combine, because I'm right in the middle again. Like, I'm like, oh, dude, I love the tape. I love the player. I love the ability. But there are times where I'm like, he's struggling with this corner. He just looks a little sluggy. Is he actually slow? You know what I mean? And a lot of times with those big guys, the long striders, it's hard to tell how fast they really are because they're always gliding. They always take the big ass steps, and it's just impossible to figure out like what's his speed really like. And another thing I always think of too is like back to the human element. Sometimes they just ain't trying. Sometimes they're not running 100%. They always test the miles per hour of the football at the combine when quarterbacks throw, and I'm like, they're not throwing as hard as they can. You know what I mean? Like that's a pretty weird representation of like Andy Dalton threw faster than Joe Flacco. I'm like, that's not right, because Flacco wasn't throwing 100% at the like he wasn't throwing a fastball. So yeah, sure, you can cling to that data, but if they're not doing it with the intent of giving you the testing numbers, then why are we doing it? I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, well, that's always what scares me with like GPS. Sorry to interrupt you, John.
Go ahead.
No, so the first issue I think we have is that Justin's like got a lag, and so that's what's throwing us off a little bit, but it's okay.
I do.
How fast do you think he's gonna run?
Keon Coleman?
Yeah.
4.54.
Okay. Because the range estimate I've got is from, the low being 4.42, the high being 4.58.
That's big. That is broad.
Oh yeah, but you got to go with the broad until they actually run it.
Yeah. But see, here's the thing.
So before we talk about Florida State, first off, let's go ahead and get this out of the way. This is the elephant when you in the room with Florida State. Should Florida State be in the playoff or not?
No. I'm sorry to break.
We're all on the same page here.
Danny Cannell hates us.
We're all on the same page. Okay. So because I was very vocal about it on Twitter the night before, and I watching that Louisville game, I really thought that I was like heartbroken watching it, going, they're about to get in over Alabama because they're undefeated. And then when, absolute jubilation when, Alabama's announced as the number 4 team. Thank you, ESPN, for dragging that out for way longer than you had to. But no, so I want to get that out of the way. With Keon was on my underrated list, like my all underrated team coming into the year, because he was a guy I thought that could have a really huge year, explode, be a potential first-round guy, because he had really juicy traits and didn't play as much as I wanted him to at Michigan State. But the other thing about him, too, is he was a 2-sport athlete in college at Michigan State. I don't know if you guys know that or not, but he played basketball for Michigan State, but he was a guard. He didn't play much basketball because he's playing football, but, he played. So just the fact that you're on a Big Ten football team and a Big Ten basketball team, not just any basketball team in the Big Ten, but team. Michigan State, that says something about where you are athletically. So to me, yeah, he's a little bit of a long strider, and I think long striders are definitely, like you said, really hard to evaluate because you see them, their legs aren't churning like those little guys do, like the little Tutu Atwells and the running backs of the Deuce Vaughns of the world, but they're moving. And every time that I've watched Keon play, because I think that he's got very good speed, he just pulls away from people, especially in the open field and running his route, separation, pulls away from people, and it's just his pure speed. So I think he's going to probably run, bringing the broad estimate down. I think he's going to run somewhere between a 4.44 and a 4.49.
Wow.
That's my guess.
I mean, the way these guys prep for testing, it wouldn't shock me at all. And he might just be fast, too. Those long strides might be covering more ground than I'm giving him credit for, and he might just be fast, right? Like I said, sometimes he might just be dogging it. He might just be tired. I don't know. That was just one of my concerns that I would have. Like, if I'm a GM, I would say, I need to see Coleman's testing. I just need to check that off the list and get it over with. And, yeah, so for me, I'm like, and, I mean, Jarvis, you brought this up a few weeks ago with Marvin Harrison Jr., I'm asking myself with Keon Coleman, like, what's the number that I would actually have? What's the lowest he could run, basically, that would change my mind on him. You know what I mean? And so right now I'm prepping for like, all right, if he runs 4.6s, like where do I go with that? Not saying you will, but I mean, you got to prep for the worst, right? And so I'm hoping he's that guy this year that doesn't like opt out of the 40, because a lot of those big dudes do. They know they're not going to get a great start. They know some things could go wrong for them, and they don't want their stock to drop when they probably know they are faster than what they're going to run. So I'm like, just please run, please God, run for me so I can watch it. Makes the combine that much more enjoyable.
Have you answered that question yet, though, with where he needs to run?
I mean, I think
because I think if he runs anything less than a 4.55, I might be a little skittish.
I was thinking 4.57 for some reason. That was my number where I'm like, that's the one where I'm like, he's slow. He's slow, dude. Because especially if you're training for these tests and you still come in that slow, that means you're probably slower than that. And he's going to jump out of the gym. I have no doubt about that. I think he's going to do all the testing pretty elite, but I think the 40 is the one thing where it's going to be a little bit of a factor. And those long striders are tough to stay with because they're running. Let's say they stack you. Now you have that whole stride where you can't get that close to him. So I think a little bit of credit is due to him. Is like he's gonna compensate for it, and he's probably gonna overcome it even if he does run slow. But I mean, stacked in a class like the one he's in, it's that little thing that will separate you from Odunze and Marvin Harrison Jr. and Neighbors and maybe even the Texas guys or even Leggett to some teams. You know what I mean? So it doesn't change that he'll be a good player. It doesn't really change the evals individually, but it does change where he'll be stacked up against the rest of the class, right?
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I'd ask if, let's say he gets instead of 4.57, let's go, he hits 4.58 or 4.59. How much does that affect? Like, how do you drop it? Like, do you drop him down? Like, you don't like kill him and say, oh, he's down 2 rounds now, right? Like, how much do you recalibrate based on that, right? Like,
we're gonna have. I don't know about you, Jarvis. I'm gonna probably end up the way I'm thinking with 15 to 17 first round grades this year.
Yeah.
That's what I'm kind of starting to feel like I'm going to have at the end of the year. Looking at the guys, it might be less than that too, because I don't think it's a real top heavy. I think it's really deep in the day 2 range. If he runs a 4.58, 4.59, I don't think he's going to have a first round grade from me. I think that's going to be enough to push him down. So he'll still be a first, second,
yeah.
But now I'm talking about. Okay, I'm gonna take Odunze before him because Odunze, especially at the end of the year, has had a fantastic season. And the last couple games I've watched from him, Utah, and the Oregon Pac-12 championship, he's unbelievable. Like, he's just unbelievable. I wasn't buying it early, and now I'm like, okay, no, I've seen what I need to see. With Neighbors, he's unbelievable. And so that if he runs a 4.59, I can't justify putting Keon Coleman ahead of those two by itself. I can't. So that's where he drops. So in the positional ranking, he drops 2 or 3 spots.
Well, here's kind of why I asked that is because like there's an interesting question of like I think it's a philosophical thing of like how many grains of sand makes a sand pile, and you kind of get like one at a time, and you like eventually it's a sand pile, but you can't pick the single individual grain that gets you there. And so I view that from the standpoint of like each little step in testing, like what's the difference between a 32-inch vert and a 33-inch vert? Or a 4.59 versus the 4.58 versus the 5.7, 5.6. Like, how do you differentiate between the 5.9 drops him versus a 5.2? Okay, we're cool. I'm not going to drop him down the stack, right? Like, how do you figure out how to balance that?
I think that's where you go back and compare him with past. It might not make a big difference of what he actually is as an individual, but it kind of puts him in like a different set of data, right? Where that 32-inch vert puts him with a bunch of busts, and somehow the 33 puts him with like, oh, there's some productive guys on that list. As stupid again as that might sound, I think that's the reality of it, and that's why it is so important to get like testing and look at the past and look at all these players stacked up next to each other. And like for this class, for instance, it doesn't like Keon Coleman running slow. You wouldn't just drop him like without context. I think you would say, all right, well, now I have to put these receivers ahead of him because they check different boxes and they're worth the risk taking them this high because they have this quantifiable speed and it's much faster than Keon. Or as a team, I think like we were talking about earlier, you would say, you know, we're not going to take him in the first. We have pick number 26. We're not taking him there. If he falls past 39, we'll consider trading up for him. Or that's the point when we say he's worth the value for us. Stuff like that. I don't know if it's exactly like that, but I think that's the way it kind of falls when, you know, a player doesn't meet the certain like threshold that you wanted him to meet because he's still a good player. And if you evaluate him as a good player, like, you know, that's your thing. It's not that he's now bad, but it's now like we cannot evaluate what he's given us past the, until it gets to this certain point in the draft, because at the end of the day, it's just a height, weight, speed auction. It's a cattle auction, and you're just like,
the
what's
risk profile is different. Yeah.
What's the lowest we can pay for this guy? Exactly. So, that's what it boils down to. But
there's one thing I wanted to look at. Go ahead. Go ahead, Justin.
I was about to say I got to go.
He's got to go hit the ice.
So the last thing I'll ask, I'll just add before you go there is, I was looking at a guy. This isn't their height is comparable based on the measurement that I have of Keon right now. Their weight is not, but a guy that he reminds me of running, and with being long strides and pulling away in the open field, is Derrick Henry, who ran a 4.54. Now the difference is, I think Derrick ran a 1.60 split, 10-yard split. And I think Coleman has a little bit better of a get off there. That's where I pulled my estimation. That's why I just wanted to add that.
I tweeted he's what people wanted N'Keal Harry to be. N'Keal Harry ran a 4.49 at the combine. He just couldn't separate on the field. He kind of sucked. I think, like, if you loved Keon or if you loved N'Keal,
did he run a 4.49?
I think he did. It was
4.53 laser 4.50 hand time. So he's close. He's right there.
Okay, close. Yeah, close. But I mean, okay. So let's say, I'll just say this. I think if you love N'Keal, which I did not,
I didn't like N'Keal.
I hated him. I was like, dude, this is a third, fourth round. Yeah, I don't know why, but for some reason I like Keon, and I don't know if it's just that he's so much more acrobatic and physical and just moves a little differently. But I think this is like the redo. Like, hey, for those of you who missed on N'Keal, like, Keon's your boy. And if you, first off, if you did like N'Keal, how do you not like Keon Coleman? Because he's just a better version of him, I think. So it's like, it feels like pretty much common sense. But I got to run, boys. I got a hockey game. Wish me luck. John, don't say anything like break a leg or anything, because last time you said that, I did tear my ACL.
Not saying anything.
So I'm gonna head out. We will do trivia next week, but nice to see you, boys. And I'm gonna head out.
I got one.
I was like, I can't say anything. Okay,
man.
What you got?
Okay, no, I just lost my train of thought. It was something in regards to the 40 times. Oh, here's what it was. The aspect of, I like to do an estimate on my own just because I think that gives you a comparable of, like, if I put down 4.45 as my number, right? And he goes out there and he does 4.35 or 4.55, then I can go, okay, was I way off on him? Like, what different information do I have now? Like, if I put 4.45 and he runs 4.46, I'm like, okay, nothing's changed, I think having that number just kind of is like an estimate, gives you a comparable to where you can say, okay, do I need to adjust for new information, or am I fine to sit where I'm at post testing numbers?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that is important too, with trying to estimate that side of it, because there are guys that play different at game speed, and they play different with the pads on. Like, that's the other aspect of it that's really difficult. So we use the testing. Everybody does it the same. That's why we don't just, hey, everybody, put on the pads, go run a 40 now, because that should be more relevant, because that's going to erase, 30 years of combine data, and render it worthless. So we've already gone this far. We can't change that.
Yeah.
But there are guys that run differently in pads. I'm just trying to think of a guy off the top of my head that kind of fits. Well, I guess you could even say Derrick Henry. I remember people when he ran the 4.54, they were like, "Oh, he's too slow." And it's like, but do you see this motherfucker when he gets up to speed? Like it's kind of terrifying, you know? Like
Yeah.
he's big and yeah, once you get him past that 10-yard threshold, because his 10-yard split is really more comparable to offensive linemen than it is anything else. But once you get him past that and he's running, and we've seen that, he's such a big physical presence, you can't get him down anyways. So, and he's pulling away from people. So, but with Keon, he's got a better jump, but they run similar. You know, when they're going and engaging into long speed, they've got a very similar gait, very similar stride. Keon just starts faster. So that tells me he's probably going to run faster than 4.5. And that's why I put him right there in the 4.45, you know, where that's pretty much my number that I'm thinking he's going to hit.
Gotcha. And it's tricky
It wouldn't
too.
shock
Because,
me if he ran a 4.39.
well, it's tricky too,
You know
like
what
you
I'm
said,
saying?
because yeah, different guys run so differently too. Like you'll have this like normally you run 4.54, you're not running a 1.6 or whatever 10. Like usually if you're a lot of guys that are fast all the way through, or guys that are slow all the way through. But you'll get these weird hybrids where some guys just need that really really long runway. So they play slow because the game's in these 10-yard increments at most usually, and then it's like, okay, well, he ran really well. Like offensive lineman 40s, for instance. Offensive line 40s, even though a lot of teams prefer the 10, they're still viewed in a way of like, oh, this guy ran a 4.9 as an offensive lineman. That's a really big deal. It tells you a lot about who he is as an athlete. Like he's a really, really good athlete. But at the same time, that's such a different thing than what you're going to see from any way you're going to use him in the game, right? So it's just tricky trying to compare that. I think it's a great bar just in terms of general athleticism. And usually guys that run pretty well are generally pretty good athletes, but it's far from a 1-to-1.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, it's so hard. We can't talk about, you know, or I just can't stress enough how hard it is to be, 6'7", 302 pounds and go run a 4.89. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's insane. You know, Jake Witt, in case you didn't know, I had to bring that up. Went 7th round because he literally ran a 4.89 on his pro day. Went to Central Michigan to do it. Was out of Northern Michigan. Nobody knew who he was. I had heard about him through the agent. I think we talked about him on here at one point. But yeah, like it says a lot about their general athletic ability and just how farther they are. But in the broad scheme of things, and talking about how 40 translates from an offensive lineman as opposed to a running back or a wide receiver, it's vastly different. So what I think the other thing too that I've noticed specifically about offensive linemen, and this is kind of rambling and going into almost another thought, is that everybody has a specific type that they like. And it's all dependent on who the offensive line coach is. And this was something I kind of got tipped on over this past year, where if you want to project offensive linemen, you figure out who the offensive line coach is first and what type of offensive lineman he likes. And once you figure that out, you're pretty much going to figure out who the team's targets are. When you look at Philadelphia and you look at their bookend tackles, Lane Johnson, Jordan Matala, they're both big guys. They're both long. And they both kind of have the same approach when they back into their anchor, where they use their length to neutralize the defender and prolong the contact, the initial contact. And at that point, they're able to control the rep just about all the way through. And that's why Lane Johnson, I don't think, has given up a sack in 4 or 5 years by himself on a one-on-one rep, because he is so good at setting and coming off and not engaging with that defender initially with his hands and forcing that defender to make a decision. Am I going to try to beat him to the outside? Am I going to counter inside? But I haven't even engaged him yet, so I can't even think about that. He stalls the defender and buys himself an extra second. And, so there's different styles to playing. That's the type of tackle personally prefer because I feel like I could build a pocket with two guys like that. Matala's like that too. He's a little bit more aggressive and he's bigger, so he's able to make up for it. But, like Lane Johnson is one of those guys that is so much fun to watch on tape because of just how artistic he is with his drop. But yeah, that's what it comes down to is figure out what the offensive line coach likes and then roll with it. But yeah, totally different thought, but just popped in my head, came out. ADD.
How much of that do you think is just the pure raw athlete, like the frame, the ability, like the length, versus how much of that do you think is stuff that's been coached into them in terms of how they just engage with blocks?
It's so first off, the physical presence helps Lane. Because I think his arm length is ridiculous. If I remember correctly, it's been a long time since I've
both of them are. That's why I asked, because both of them are like enormous. Like I'll pull up.
Yeah, I want to say they both have at least 34.5-inch arms. I want to say 35.
I'll give you both. And Lane is just like the freak of all freaks. Like you mentioned, Jake Witt being a freak at 6'7", 302, 489. Like, okay, so here's what we got. Lane was 6'6", 303, 469 hand time with 35 and 2/8-inch arms.
469?
469 hand time. 472 laser. Yeah.
I didn't know that. Holy.
Dude, yeah, Lane is like the freak of like offensive line testing. Like it's as good as it gets. And then Jordan, it was I don't have the arm and the wingspan pulled up here on Draft Scout, but I know it's like in the 35, 36 range. But he was 6'0", 385, ran a 5'12" with a 6'7", 6'3" cone. So you're talking about two like freak athletes, right? And that's why I asked, because obviously like you have certain stylistic things that like certain coaches will want and certain ways they want their players. But like at a certain point, some of that is just like you're in such bizarro athlete territory. Like it doesn't matter. Like Lane could have bad technique in it. Like at that level of athlete, it's kind of just so far above everyone else. He'd still find some.
So I guess right? With him. Right, but yeah, with him, it's first off when you line up on him and he's standing there and he's just so physically imposing. That's the first thing I think that makes a defender hesitate. But then he does dictate it because he's got a really great, jump step when he what's that term? I know that's not the correct term. I can't think of it right now. When he steps back, when he gets into his drop, I mean, kick step. That's it. He's got a beautiful kick step and sets up so perfectly. But what he's doing with this kick step that's different than a lot of other people is he's setting up the defender so the defender has to pick where he's going to go. But he's buying time and he's using his length. He's got his length. He's got his arms out there. And that defender's hesitating because he's trying to figure out how am I going to attack. And I mean, it's like pulling out the perfect chess defense strategy. You're black, and you're pulling out something that you're setting it up. You're protecting all your pieces, and you're making it so that if you want to get to my king, you got to figure out how you're going to do it. I'm going to make you suffer to do it. You're going to lose some pieces, but it's going to take you some time. The difference there is he's so physically imposing that even when you engage with him, he's gonna respond. So like with Lane and Jordan's the same way. They use that length to make that defender hesitate and try to figure out how they're going to work around him. So I would say 60% of it, just going through careful thought as I'm stalling with my explanation. I'm running calculations in my head. 60% of it is natural ability, and 40% of it, I don't think he came out there and started playing tackle like this in high school. I've watched a lot of high school tackles play, and your first instinct as an offensive lineman is to engage with the guy and stop him. And so I think that there's a certain element of coaching that he's gotten over the years that's built that technique, that's built that style to him. And there's a lot of guys that are starting to buy this style. They're starting to use it for themselves. and it works out really well, especially as a pass protector. So, but Lane is the first guy that I remember seeing really play like that. And also now understanding how well he tested, I didn't realize that. He came out in 2013. Is that correct?
Yes.
Lane Johnson was a 2013 draft pick.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's like before I was doing this. So that's probably why I never realized that. But no, when you figure out, my point was, when you figure out what the offensive lineman likes to do, the offensive line coach likes, you can figure out who they're going to target in the draft based on the skill set, the style that they prefer having. So that's, people think that to scout football players, for some reason, to scout NFL draft picks, you don't have to watch the NFL as much. No. I'm tuned in every Sunday and watching football all day, because that's how I'm going to figure out what the teams want, is by watching them and evaluating. Like, I have just as deep notes on the NFL right now as I do on college, where I'm looking at it more from a standpoint of what are they doing schematically, what are the player types that they want, and building that for every team so that I can properly project guys. Because, and that's why I don't like to make picks on, everybody keeps asking me who's going to be the first overall pick. People that I know, people that I see around my hometown, people on Twitter. I couldn't tell you right now. I don't know who's picking. I have no idea. I think it's going to be a quarterback, because Chicago, I can't see Chicago holding on to number one pick, assuming that Carolina continues to suck and keeps the number one pick, which belongs to Chicago. I can't see him keeping it, so somebody's going to trade up for it. And until that trade happens, I have no idea who's going number one. I don't, because I need to see what they're doing schematically. I need to see what the coaches look like and what they're going to try to run. That's what I need to figure out. So
I've got a couple of things I would throw out there too from that, and one would be, I know I mentioned that article that's on my pen tweet last week, but there's a section there that talks about there was a study done on NBA players, and I've kind of compared it to NFL players. The study was essentially that the scarcity of very, very tall people affects the skill distribution of the NBA. So if you think of like the total variance in terms of like ability to just put up points between like the very small guys, if you're talking 6'2", like 6'3", 6'4", guys were a lot more like kind of grouped up, and it wasn't like there was just big gap, right? Versus if you look at like 7 foot, 7'1", so on and so forth, there's so few of those guys. They make it in just because they're that big, but the gap between shooting between like a Kevin Durant, for instance, versus some bench warmer guy is just so much wider. So I view that from the perspective, you look at like the NFL, you look at a guy like Lane Johnson, again, going back to his number, 6'6", 303, ran 4.72, and he's got 35-inch arms. Like, you're talking about a very, very rare human being. You're talking about a legitimate 1 in a million, if not even more scarce. And so I think that's an interesting lens to put on. That's what I try to put on it, but I know obviously coaches view it very differently. Of like, they have different types they like, and they have different ways they want to view it in terms of like the type of guy they prefer. But I think just that aspect of the scarcity of guys that are that big, that are that athletic, it's an interesting topic to compare. Like, I don't know if you've heard a lot of scouts talking about planet theory, as far as like have you heard that saying before?
No,
Planet theory?
I have. Not by that term, but just the whole fact that you have 5% of the American population is over 6'2", 200 pounds. That's 6'2", 200. I'm not saying 200. So when we've got a 6'5", 300-pound guy, that's liquid gold, and he can move. That's liquid gold, literally. That is human gold. And so, like, that came up a couple of years ago when I was at the Combine, and that Missouri State defensive tackle that ended up going the 5th round in the Colts that year. I can't think of his name, but he was out of Missouri State. He didn't get invited to the Combine after doing the NFL PA Bowl, got called up to the Senior Bowl, and played really well. Didn't get a Combine invite. And there was a lot of talk around the Combine from scouts going, he should be here, because literally, here's why. Because 6'5", 300 pounds, and he can move. He needs to be here. So yeah, there is a scarcity factor that's into it. But by planet theory, what were you specifically talking about?
No, it's just the same idea of like planet theory being that you have such a scarcity of there's only so many people on planet Earth that meet a
Right.
certain height, weight, speed type of distribution. So you thinking of Eric Johnson, defensive tackle?
Yes, that's him.
Yes.
Yep.
So and that's a perfect example of it, right? So 6'0", 299, 4'8", 40, 34 and 2/8 inch arms, and obviously did not get that combine invite, but I think that's when you look at how a lot of these teams view that. Obviously, it's not every team, but just if you were to compare those numbers across the board against every guy historically, like there were just so few of those types of guys, and they end up, even if not necessarily the tape being where you want it to be, they just end up having this like higher value in the draft just because of the scarcity of the type of player, the type of athlete.
Right. Exactly. And that's the other part of it too. That's always interesting. People, I know when I started doing this, that was not something I understood. You know, it wasn't really until when you start to understand, defensive lines and defensive schematics, and where the NFL is going with that, and then build that into what you're describing as planet theory, which is a perfect way to describe it. And when you got these guys and they just fit that body type and they have the athletic profile to go with it, they're going to get opportunities regardless of what their technique looks like, what their hands look. Their hands could be some of the worst hands you've ever seen. They don't know where to put them. They don't know how to attack an offensive lineman. That's okay because you're big. You're going to eat a block. And when you got a 6'5", 300-pound guy and he can move, he offers that threat, you're going to get doubled a lot. One of the things that's exploded in recent, NFL defensive strategy is, the bear front and going with the 5-man front. And as long as you've got one guy on that interior who's going to eat a double, you've got a one-on-one with a tight end or a running back on the outside, and you're going to be one of your star edge rushers if you've got them. So just playing, schematics and talk, and that's why everybody's got a bear front now. That's difficult to contend with. So that's why I see body types and I jump all over them. Whether they're at this point, whether they've got the technique or not, they're going to have value in the league because that's how everybody else looks at it too.
Yeah. I'm not sure how much longer you want to keep going on. I'm fine to keep going, but I know we're running a little long here. One more thing I would throw out, and you might disagree with this.
Okay.
It's a little bit differentiating from your opinion of like, oh, I got to watch NFL tape a lot and kind of know what's in the league. I'm not saying I won't watch it, but I'm a lot less, okay, let me really grind it and try to see everything playing in the league right now. I know a lot of people try to do that like as a refresher. My view of it is that you can almost treat draft value a lot of times as like a proxy, right? Like a guy that goes top 10 presumably goes top 10 because most of the teams in the league think, hey, this guy is worthy of this type of value that has a certain expected translation to the league, if that makes sense. Like you take a guy top 5, you're assuming he's going to be an all pro. That's kind of just, it has a direct translation going to the league. Even if you're not watching how the guy actually turns into in the league, you kind of knew what the expectation was. And
Right.
I think if you were to look at college football as a whole, or just through the entire pre-draft process, there are certain guys that meet those standards of like a Will Anderson. Okay, super productive, good athlete, checks all these other boxes. And you kind of know, even without having to directly say, this is what he's going to be in the NFL and be really specific about it, you can still know just based on his resume and all those check boxes that he's going to be drafted within a certain range. And then that range kind of tells you how teams are most likely to view him. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So the reason that I spend the time going through the tape now, I will watch all 22. I don't watch NFL all 22 as much as I watch college, but I will watch all 22. A lot of the stuff that I'm doing is on Sunday, getting a game day feel, kind of that kind of stuff. When we get to the off season, there will be like one day a week that I'll sit down and I'll watch all 22, and that's all I'm doing that day is NFL all 22. The reason for that is projection, because there are certain teams in the league that are going to take certain types of guys, and understanding who those teams are and what those guys are that they're looking for. That's what I'm like. Detroit is a great example right now of a team that's just going to take good guys regardless of where the rest of the league might have them. And they've had real success doing it too. Aiden Hutchinson's been a really good hit for them, second overall. Granted, he was probably going to go that high whether they were picking or not. He was going to go up in that top 10 range, but they took him to second, perfect hit. And then you look at this class, Jahmyr Gibbs at 12. Yeah, Gibbs was going to go that high. There was teams lined up behind him that were hoping the Lions weren't going to take him there, and they did because they were going to take him. But Jack Campbell right after that, nobody was going to take Jack Campbell before probably 25th overall. And they went ahead and jumped and took him there. And the reason for that is because and Justin mentioned him earlier, he fits their scheme perfectly and their culture. So Pittsburgh's another team that's like that usually. New England is a team that's like that. There's a bunch of teams that are in the league that they're going to take certain types of guys. And so that helps me in my projection because when I'm looking at the rosters, ahead of the draft going, okay, here's where this guy could potentially go because he fits what this team needs. It's something that they're looking for. It's a spot on the roster that they're going to need to fill. Whether that's a backup, whether that's a starting role, I don't care. It's a spot it's going to fill. So that helps my projection going forward with that. The other thing too is offensive. I brought up the offensive line deal because, first off, we haven't done an offensive line episode yet. That's going to be something that we'll do probably in the off season once we get past this draft year, and go through the different positions and tackle, guard, center, all that. But the big thing there with all, and the reason I just brought up the offensive lineman specifically is because that's the biggest key dependent position on what teams are looking for specifically. I think that there's a lot of flexibility with running backs. There's a lot of flexibility with wide receivers. There's a lot of flexibility with defensive backs and linebackers and even defensive linemen. Because there's so many different ways that you can scheme them and different places you can put them and different stunts you can run, different routes, different concepts. Whereas on the offensive line, there's not that many different ways to play offensive linemen in the sense compared to other positions. It's a more meat and potatoes position, keep things simple. The extravagant stuff is what you see San Francisco doing, pulling people and having Trent Williams who can do anything basically, and floating, different concepts like that. Miami does it a lot too, which is, where San Francisco got it from, Mike McDaniel. But it's the offensive line it's the heart of the team, and it's a high priority position group. So, first couple rounds of the draft, if you've got a hole there and there's a guy that fits what that team is looking for, 90% of the time they're going to take it. They're going to take them there. And that helps my projection, and that's why I spend the time looking at figuring out what they're doing schematically. It also helps me because on the back end, how many teams are legitimately going to be interested in this quarterback or this wide receiver or this offensive lineman or this edge rusher because he's fitting what they want to do. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Isaiah Foskey is a guy I liked a couple years ago out of Notre Dame. I really liked Foskey. And I think if he had come out 10 years earlier when there were still a lot of teams that were running 3-4 fronts, 3-4 bases, he would have been a first-round pick. And my projection hadn't, adjusted to that yet. And so he's got a first-round grade from me, and I'm thinking, yeah, you can plug him in here, you can plug him into all these different things, and no. He went to Chicago. He hasn't played a lot. He hasn't been productive. So the whole point of me bringing up the why I watch the NFL and all that is because that's where I got that from, is going, if I'm not understanding what the league is doing, I can't properly project a lot of these guys that I'm looking at because that's a huge part of projection is they got to have a spot. They got to have a role. And if 90% of the teams right now are running 4-man fronts, those 3-man front guys, those 3-man front guys, those outside linebackers, those edge rushers that can't put their hand in the dirt, they don't have a spot anymore.
Yeah.
Unless they're
fair.
just truly elite.
Yeah. No, that's an interesting review. And I think the thing that always gets me is like, there's actually a couple things I thought were pretty interesting in here. One is this idea of like this, I guess you could call it macro versus micro kind of approach to it. So like micro would be viewing any one individual team and what are their preferences and what are their needs and like what types of guys would they be interested in, and trying to project who they might want is vastly different from trying to do the macro projecting like across the league, all 32, what is most popular there. You know what I'm saying? So I think it's interesting to compare those two levels. And then also going to like teams valuing guys more than others. For instance, like you mentioned Detroit, I think it's interesting from the standpoint of like, there's this idea in complexity science called emergence, which is essentially that you can take all these system, and the overall system shows properties that aren't necessarily explainable by any of the individual pieces, if that makes sense. So like you could look at like, let's say the Lions defense, they take Jack Campbell. Does he add an element beyond like just his own physical ability, beyond his own tools? Like, does he give something to that defense that kind of elevates everything around him, if that makes sense? So I think trying to apply those ideas is interesting in terms of how you view, like, I guess the difference in like value for like what Campbell would give to the Lions versus what he would give to another team, let's say. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely.
And I don't know if there's anything more beyond that. Like, I think emergence is a whole different topic that we'd have to cover in more in depth and it kind of
spend a lot of time on.
Yeah, we could spend a lot of time on that.
That's where my brain was going. It's like,
I don't think we can fit that in tonight. It's a pretty.
No.
I'd want to do some more homework on that. I'll be honest. I have a decent understanding of it now, but I'd want to really, really do my homework and have some quotes prepared for that.
That would be a good topic to get into. And so next week, just to preview next week, we are being joined by a 2024 NFL draft prospect. John Morgan out of Arkansas is currently slated to join us next week on the show. I think it's going to be a really good interview. And, you know, because I talked to him about the different stuff that we do on the show and why it's different from others. And I think he's going to be a really good fit for what we want to get into on the defensive line. So John Morgan will be joining us out here next week on the show. Really excited to have our first 2024 prospect on here. I'm sure he will not be the only one. He'll be the first of many that we'll have through, this season. But I think that's about going to do it. You got anything else you want to throw out before we wrap this up?
Not really, other than I'm just excited to come up with some questions for John Morgan. I was thinking about it earlier today when I was driving home. Like, dang, what do I want to ask him? What kinds of questions do I think would be a good thing to approach him with?
Oh, yeah, no, he's going to be a good one, man. He's going to be a really good one. I'm excited about this one. So, well, Justin he bounced. So for Justin, for Mark, I'm John. Join us next week right here on the show, listening to John Morgan. And Shane, go ahead and get us out of here.
And that's a wrap. Hope you don't miss us too much until next time. Follow the Sick Podcast with Draft Vogel on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, Google Play, and Apple Podcasts.